the story of Truong My Lan's $44 billion scandal. Truong My Lan, a wealthy developer in Vietnam, has been sentenced to death for defrauding a bank of billions of dollars. My Lan was found guilty of embezzlement, bribing state officials, and violating bank lending regulations after she used her hidden ownership of the Saigon Commercial Bank to channel $44 billion of loans to her own companies. This scandal is described as one of the greatest bank frauds in history, and it has stained Asia's fastest-growing economy. My Lan was born in 1956 in Saigon, South Vietnam, to a modest but entrepreneurial family. She learned how to hustle from an early age at the Bentham Market, an iconic and bustling hub known for its intense bargaining culture. By the mid-1990s, she ventured into the property market. Around this time, Vietnam was undergoing a transformation, and land was officially under state control. To get access to it, My Lan had to sway state officials. In 1992, Lan met Eric Chu Nap Ky, an investor from Hong Kong, and they got married, had 2 daughters, and built an empire of restaurants, hotels, and properties across Vietnam and Hong Kong. Her wealth exploded, and by 2010, things started to go dodgy. My Lan was a major player in Vietnam's financial scene, and her company was one of Vietnam's richest real estate firms. She was powerful and had good standing with the community, so she was entrusted with arranging the merger of 3 struggling banks into the Saigon Commercial Bank, SCB. However, from 2012 onwards, My Lan began to siphon funds, giving loans to herself and her friends, and paying bribes to government officials to keep them quiet. Over the years, she ended up owning 90% of the bank, which is why she managed to own 90% of the bank. One of My Lan's multi-billion-dollar bank fraud schemes was to set up thousands of shell companies, and she put the ownership of these companies and bank shares in other people's names. As the scheme grew, more people were involved, and 93% of the approved loans went straight into Lan's pocket. In the decade leading up to her arrest, My Lan lent herself $44 billion in illegal loans, making it difficult for anyone to notice that much money was missing. My Lan was known for her connections to Saigon Commercial Bank and her ability to hide her dealings as an open secret. Despite passing audits from major companies like KPMG, My Lan would hand out bribes, such as the largest ever recorded in Vietnam, to top government officials. Over the course of 3 years, My Lan instructed her driver to withdraw 108 trillion Vietnamese dong from the bank and store it in her basement, which was equivalent to $4 billion. However, My Lan's luck was about to run out as her empire was about to collapse. Vietnamese authorities were undertaking a scorched earth policy on corruption, with Phu Trong leading an anti-corruption campaign called Blazing Furnace since 2013. The campaign focused on public sector corruption and promised to make Vietnam a cleaner and safer place to do business. As the US-China trade war raged, companies scrambled to find new manufacturing locations, and the Communist Party took corruption in the private sector more seriously. As the US-China trade war continued, foreign business investment poured in, and companies like Samsung, LG, and Apple invested billions into high-tech manufacturing. Vietnam became Apple's biggest manufacturing hub outside of China. However, anyone found to be corrupt would be in hot water, and the more corrupt they were, the hotter the water. In October 2022, My Lan was arrested and sentenced to death less than 2 years later. The initial fallout from My Lan's arrest included the identification of around 42,000 victims, bondholders, and ordinary people who trusted SCB with their life savings. The court trial was televised and was a spectacle, with 104 boxes of evidence presented in the trial. The collapse of the empire brought a once strong housing market to its knees, property firms shut down in record numbers, and authorities seized over 1,000 properties. The Vietnam Central Bank had to step in to prevent a financial meltdown, pumping $24 billion in special loans into SCB to avoid a banker run. The government also turned to foreign investors to stabilize the situation. But some analysts think that the arrest backfired and made foreign investment skittish at the time when Vietnam was poised to become the next global manufacturing hub. The case of a property tycoon in Vietnam who was sentenced to death for stealing 3% of the country's GDP in fraud has been a topic of debate among authorities. The death penalty verdict is relatively common in Vietnam, but rarely applied in cases of financial crimes, especially with someone with no prior convictions. The story behind the move has been the subject of much speculation, with some experts suggesting that the Communist Party used My Lan as an example to show the world that they were taking corruption seriously. Others speculate that the whole thing could just be a ruse to terrify My Lan into giving up more of her stolen assets and accomplices. My Lan pleaded not guilty and blamed her subordinates, admitting that she was involved in the restructuring of the bank but did not misappropriate its funds. She also told the court that by getting into the banking industry without sufficient experience and a lack of understanding of legal matters, she got into the situation. The courts didn't buy it, and all in all, 855 people were charged, including My Lan's husband, who was sentenced to 9 years in prison, and My Lan's niece, who was sentenced to 17 years. 2 former executives of the SCB Bank have fled the country and are still on the run. The case of My Lan in Vietnam has highlighted the devastating impact of unchecked greed on society, even the very wealthy. The officials may have pretended to look the other way because My Lan's main patron, a powerful man, was one of the top 15 or so leaders of the country. Nuriel Gino Yazdinian.